The furious restaurant manager's finger jabbed toward the exit as her voice echoed through Romano's Italian bistro. "I want you out of my restaurant right now." Senator John Kennedy rose from his half-finished lasagna, every eye in the Chicago establishment fixed on this stunning confrontation. But what happened next would transform both their lives forever, proving that sometimes God's greatest miracles begin with our angriest moments. The evening had started peacefully enough for Senator Kennedy, who had arrived in Chicago just 3 hours earlier for a banking committee hearing scheduled for the next morning. After checking into his hotel near the Loop, he'd walked 6 blocks through the chilly October air, drawn by the warm glow emanating from Romano's windows and the handwritten "Family Recipes Since 1952" sign hanging by the entrance. Kennedy had chosen a corner table where he could observe the bustling restaurant while reviewing his notes for tomorrow's hearing. The place buzzed with the comfortable energy of regular customers greeting familiar servers, the clink of wine glasses, and animated conversations in both English and Italian. He'd ordered the lasagna and a glass of sweet tea, amused when the server explained they only had unsweetened. What Kennedy didn't know was that the restaurant's manager, Diana Rossetti, had been having the worst month of her professional life. 3 longtime servers had quit without notice, their best supplier had raised prices by 30%, and yesterday morning she'd received an eviction notice for her elderly mother's apartment. The stress was crushing her, but she'd managed to hold things together until tonight. Diana had been rushing between the kitchen and dining room when she overheard 2 customers at table 12 discussing Senator Kennedy's presence. "That's him, the one from Louisiana," one whispered. "My brother says he's the reason those banking regulations got blocked last year." Diana's hands had frozen on the coffee pot she was carrying, her mind immediately jumping to her mother's situation. 6 months earlier, Diana's 74-year-old mother, Rosa Rossetti, had fallen victim to a predatory lending scheme that targeted elderly homeowners. A smooth-talking representative had convinced her to take out a reverse mortgage with hidden fees and escalating payments. When Rosa couldn't keep up, the bank had started foreclosure proceedings, eventually forcing her to sell her home of 40 years at a significant loss. Diana had spent her life savings helping her mother fight the foreclosure, hiring lawyers and financial advisors who ultimately couldn't unravel the deliberately complex contract Rosa had signed. The experience had left Diana bitter toward politicians she believed protected big banks at the expense of ordinary families. She'd watched hearings on C-SPAN, growing increasingly frustrated with senators who seemed more interested in political theater than real solutions. Now, seeing Senator Kennedy calmly eating dinner while her mother faced homelessness, something inside Diana snapped. She marched over to his table, her heart pounding with righteous anger. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Are you Senator Kennedy from Louisiana?" Kennedy looked up from his notes, offering his characteristic slight smile. "Yes, ma'am, I am. Is everything all right?" "No, everything is not all right," Diana replied, her voice rising slightly. Several nearby diners turned to watch. "Do you have any idea what your banking committee votes have done to real families? To real people like my mother?" Kennedy set down his fork, his expression becoming more serious as he sensed the genuine pain behind her anger. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what specific situation you're referring to." Diana's frustration boiled over. "Of course you don't know. Politicians like you vote on things that destroy people's lives, then go eat dinner like nothing happened." Her voice was getting louder now, and the entire restaurant was beginning to take notice. Kennedy remained seated, his hands visible on the table, clearly trying not to escalate the situation. "Ma'am, would you like to sit down and tell me what happened?" "I don't want to sit down," Diana shot back. "I want you to understand that your votes have consequences. My mother lost her home because of the kind of banking practices your committee refuses to regulate properly." Kennedy's expression shifted, and he leaned forward slightly. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry to hear about your mother. What specifically happened to her?" But Diana was too upset to have a rational conversation. The restaurant had grown quiet except for Diana's voice, which was now shaking with emotion. She's 74 years old and living in a one-bedroom apartment she can barely afford because some bank convinced her to sign papers she didn't understand, and senators like you make sure those banks can keep doing it. Kennedy nodded slowly, processing her words. That sounds like predatory lending, and you're right to be angry about it. Diana's anger flared even hotter at what she perceived as a dismissive response. Don't patronize me. You probably don't even know what it's like to worry about rent or medical bills. Kennedy's jaw tightened slightly. He'd grown up poor in rural Louisiana, but he kept his voice calm. Ma'am, I understand you're hurting, but maybe we could discuss this more privately? Diana shook her head vigorously. No, I think everyone here should know exactly who you are. The situation was spiraling beyond Diana's control, fueled by months of accumulated stress and grief. You sit in Washington making decisions that hurt families like mine, then come to places like this acting like you're just a regular person. Well, you're not welcome here. Kennedy remained remarkably calm, though several diners were now openly staring. Ma'am, I respect your right to be upset, but I think there might be some misunderstanding about my positions. Diana's voice reached its peak. The only misunderstanding is that people like you think you can hide from the consequences of your actions. I want you to leave. Right now. The entire restaurant fell silent. Kennedy looked around at the dozens of eyes watching him, then back at Diana. Ma'am, I've paid for my meal, and I haven't done anything wrong here. I'm happy to discuss your mother's situation, but I'm not going to be run out. That's when Diana made the declaration that would change everything. Then I'm calling the police and having you removed for trespassing. Get out. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Kennedy sat quietly for a moment, his hand unconsciously touching the small cross necklace he wore beneath his shirt, a gift from his late grandmother, who'd taught him that anger usually masked deeper pain. What happened next surprised everyone in the restaurant, including Diana herself. Instead of arguing or making a scene, Kennedy quietly signaled for his server and asked for his check. I'll respect your wishes, ma'am, he told Diana calmly. But before I go, could I ask you something? What's your mother's name? Diana was taken aback by the unexpected question. Why do you want to know that? Kennedy pulled out his phone and opened his notes app. Because I'd like to understand what happened to her. You mentioned predatory lending, and that's actually something I've been working on. Diana stared at him suspiciously. You're just saying that. Kennedy shook his head. No, ma'am, I'm not. I've sponsored 3 bills in the last 2 years specifically targeting predatory lending practices. Could you tell me which bank was involved? For the first time since the confrontation began, Diana hesitated. She hadn't expected this response. Premier National Lending, she said quietly. Kennedy's expression darkened immediately. We've been investigating them for 18 months. They're one of the worst actors in the reverse mortgage market. He continued typing on his phone. What other details can you give me about your mother's case? Diana felt her anger beginning to shift into confusion. You're actually taking notes? Kennedy nodded, his attention focused on his phone screen. Yes, ma'am. Premier National has a pattern of targeting elderly homeowners with deliberately confusing contracts. We've been building a case, but we need more documented examples. He looked up at her. Your mother's story could be important evidence. If you believe God can use unexpected moments to reveal His grace, comment the word Amen below. The restaurant remained eerily quiet as other diners strained to hear this unexpected turn in the conversation. Kennedy's server approached cautiously with the check, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Kennedy paid quickly, leaving a generous tip, then turned back to Diana. Ma'am, I understand why you're angry with me, and you have every right to ask me to leave. But could we talk outside for just a few minutes? Diana's resolve was wavering. This wasn't how she'd expected the confrontation to go. She'd anticipated denials, political double talk, maybe even security being called. Instead, Senator Kennedy seemed genuinely interested in her mother's situation. Why should I trust you? She asked, her voice much quieter now. Because politicians always promise things they never deliver. Kennedy nodded understandingly. You're absolutely right to be skeptical. Kennedy stood slowly, gathering his coat and briefcase. Ma'am, I'm going to leave as you asked, But if you change your mind and want to talk about your mother's case, I'll be at the coffee shop across the street for the next hour." He paused, then added, "I can't promise I can fix what happened to her, but I can promise I'll listen and see what options might be available." As Kennedy walked toward the exit, the entire restaurant watched in stunned silence. Diana stood frozen by his table, her mind racing. She'd expected a fight, maybe even hoped for one. Instead, she felt confused and somehow deflated. Kennedy stopped at the door and turned back. "Ma'am, what you did tonight took courage. Don't let anyone tell you it didn't." Then he walked out into the Chicago night. The restaurant exploded into conversation the moment the door closed behind Kennedy. Diana found herself surrounded by customers and staff, all talking at once. "Was that really Senator Kennedy? Did you actually kick him out? What was that about your mother?" Diana felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, her earlier adrenaline now fading into exhaustion and doubt about what she'd just done. Tony Romano, the restaurant's owner and Diana's cousin, emerged from the kitchen where he'd been watching the entire scene. "Diana, what just happened?" he asked quietly, pulling her aside. Diana explained about her mother and the banking situation, how seeing Kennedy had triggered all her frustration. Tony listened quietly, his expression growing more concerned. "You know he left his briefcase," Tony said, pointing to the table Kennedy had vacated. Diana looked at the leather briefcase sitting beside Kennedy's chair. He'd been so focused on their conversation that he'd forgotten it completely. "Should we call the police?" Tony asked. "I mean, there might be important government documents in there." Diana stared at the briefcase, feeling an unexpected pang of guilt. Despite her anger, Kennedy had been respectful and hadn't raised his voice even once during their confrontation. "I'll take it to him," Diana said suddenly. Tony raised his eyebrows. "Are you sure? After what just happened?" Diana nodded, surprising herself with the decision. "He was actually decent about it, and I might have been wrong about a few things." She picked up the briefcase, noting how worn and practical it looked, not the expensive accessory she'd expected a senator to carry. The October air bit at Diana's face as she stepped out of the restaurant's warmth. Across the street, she could see the coffee shop Kennedy had mentioned. A small, independent place called Midnight Brew that stayed open late for the downtown crowd. Through the windows, she spotted Kennedy sitting alone at a corner table, reading something on his phone while sipping what looked like black coffee. Diana took a deep breath and crossed the street, the briefcase feeling heavier with each step. Part of her wondered if this was a mistake, if she was walking into some kind of political manipulation. But Kennedy had seemed genuinely interested in her mother's story, and something about his calm response to her outburst had shaken her assumptions about him. The coffee shop's bell chimed as Diana entered, and Kennedy looked up immediately. His expression showed surprise but not alarm. "Ma'am," he said, starting to stand. "You forgot this," Diana said, holding out the briefcase. Kennedy's face showed genuine relief. "Thank you so much. I'm usually more careful, but—" He trailed off, gesturing to an empty chair. "Would you like to sit? I understand if you don't want to." Diana hesitated, then sat down across from him. The coffee shop was nearly empty except for 2 college students studying in the far corner and a barista reading behind the counter. "I owe you an apology," Diana said quietly. "Not for being angry about my mother's situation, but for the way I handled it. You didn't deserve to be publicly humiliated like that." Kennedy shook his head. "Ma'am, you don't owe me any apology." "Yes, I do," Diana insisted. "My mother raised me better than that. She always said you treat people with respect, even when you disagree with them." Kennedy smiled slightly. "Sounds like a wise woman. Would you like some coffee?" "My treat." Diana nodded and Kennedy signaled the barista. "2 coffees, please, and whatever pastries you have left." The simple gesture felt surprisingly normal after their dramatic confrontation. As they waited for their order, Kennedy pulled out his phone again. "Would you be willing to tell me more about your mother's situation? I wasn't just being polite earlier. Premier National Lending is under active investigation by our banking subcommittee." Diana studied his face, looking for signs of political performance, but his attention seemed completely genuine. "What kind of investigation?" she asked cautiously. Kennedy explained that his subcommittee had been tracking predatory lending practices targeting elderly Americans for over 2 years. We've documented hundreds of cases where companies like Premier use high-pressure tactics and deliberately confusing contracts to take advantage of seniors, he said. But we need more evidence to build a strong enough case for prosecution. Diana felt her worldview shifting slightly. I had no idea you were working on this. Most people don't, Kennedy admitted. The banking committee doesn't get much media coverage unless there's a major crisis, but we spend most of our time on exactly these kinds of consumer protection issues. He opened a folder on his phone and showed Diana a document titled Protecting Senior Citizens from Predatory Lending Practices Act. I've been working on this bill for 18 months. Your mother's case could help us strengthen it. Diana stared at the phone screen, reading the bill's summary. It addressed many of the specific tactics that had been used against her mother: mandatory cooling-off periods, simplified disclosure requirements, and stricter penalties for companies that targeted elderly homeowners. Why haven't I heard about this? She asked. Kennedy sighed. Because it's complicated legislation that doesn't make for good sound bites, and because the banking lobby fights us on every provision. The barista brought their coffee and a plate of leftover biscotti. Kennedy pushed the plate toward Diana. Would you be willing to share your mother's story with my staff? We could potentially include her case in our report to the full committee. Diana cupped her hands around the warm coffee mug, thinking, what would that involve? Kennedy explained the process. An interview with his banking policy advisor, review of relevant documents, possibly testimony if the bill made it to committee hearings. I have to ask, Diana said, why should I trust that this isn't just political theater? How do I know you won't just use my mother's story for publicity and then forget about it? Kennedy nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right question to ask. And honestly, you shouldn't trust me just because I say so. You should verify everything I've told you. He pulled out a business card and wrote a phone number on the back. This is my banking policy advisor, Sarah Chen. Call her tomorrow and ask her about our predatory lending investigation. Ask her about Premier National specifically. Ask her about the bill I mentioned. Kennedy handed Diana the card. Don't take my word for anything. Do your own research. Talk to other people who've dealt with my office. Make an informed decision about whether you want to help us. Diana looked at the card, impressed despite herself by Kennedy's transparency. Most politicians would be promising me the world right now, trying to turn this into a photo opportunity. Kennedy chuckled. Ma'am, I've been in politics long enough to know that promises you can't keep will always come back to bite you. I can't promise we'll be able to help your mother get her house back. But I can promise we'll use her story to help prevent this from happening to other families. They talked for another 30 minutes, with Kennedy asking detailed questions about the timeline of her mother's case, the specific tactics Premier National had used, and the responses they'd received from various government agencies. Diana found herself impressed by his knowledge of banking regulations and consumer protection law. This wasn't superficial political interest. He clearly understood the technical details of how predatory lending worked. As their conversation continued, Diana realized she'd been carrying around assumptions about Kennedy based on incomplete information. I have to admit, she said, I had you completely wrong. I thought you were just another politician who protected big banks. Kennedy smiled ruefully. Well, to be fair, you probably saw some committee votes where I opposed certain regulations. But context matters. Sometimes we vote against bills not because we oppose their goals, but because they're poorly written or would hurt community banks. Kennedy pulled up his voting record on his phone and showed Diana several bills he'd supported that strengthened consumer protections. The problem with politics is that people only see the final votes, not the dozens of hours of committee work that goes into understanding these issues. Diana studied the screen, seeing vote after vote supporting consumer protection measures. Why don't you talk about this more publicly? She asked. Because consumer protection isn't exciting, Kennedy admitted. People want to hear about big dramatic issues, not technical details about banking regulations. But honestly, This stuff affects more people's daily lives than most of what makes the news. He finished his coffee and leaned back in his chair. Your mother's situation is exactly why I got into politics in the first place. My grandmother almost lost her farm to something similar back in Louisiana. Diana felt a pang of regret about the scene at the restaurant. I'm sorry I didn't give you a chance to explain any of this earlier. I was just so angry and frustrated. Kennedy waved off her apology. Ma'am, you were protecting your family. That's nothing to apologize for. If more people cared about these issues the way you do, maybe we'd make faster progress. His phone buzzed with a text message, and he glanced at it briefly. I hate to cut this short, Kennedy said, but I have an early committee hearing tomorrow, and I should probably get some sleep. He stood up and put on his coat. But I'd really like to continue this conversation. Would you be willing to come to Washington next week? I'd like you to meet some of the other families we're working with, and I think your perspective could help us strengthen our approach. Diana was surprised by the invitation. You want me to come to Washington? Kennedy nodded. All expenses paid, of course. And if your mother is up for it, I'd love to meet her too. Sometimes it helps when senators can put faces to the policies they're voting on. Diana thought about her mother, how proud Rosa would be to know her story might help other families avoid the same situation. I'll think about it, Diana said. Kennedy smiled and shook her hand. That's all I can ask, and ma'am, thank you for bringing me my briefcase. Most people would have just called hotel security. As he walked toward the door, Kennedy turned back. Oh, and tell your cousin Tony he runs a great restaurant. Best lasagna I've had outside of Louisiana. Then he disappeared into the Chicago night. Diana sat alone in the coffee shop for another 10 minutes, processing everything that had happened. 2 hours ago, she'd been furious at a senator she thought represented everything wrong with politics. Now she was considering flying to Washington to help him with legislation that could protect families like hers. The transformation felt surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's life. Back at the restaurant, Diana found Tony waiting for her with worried eyes. How did it go? He asked immediately. Diana told him about the conversation, about Kennedy's investigation of Premier National, about the invitation to Washington. Tony listened with growing amazement. So he's actually trying to help people like your mother? Diana nodded. It seems like it, but I'm going to do my research before I commit to anything. The next morning, Diana called Sarah Chen's office before even having her first cup of coffee. Kennedy's banking policy advisor spent 20 minutes on the phone with her, confirming everything Kennedy had said about their predatory lending investigation and more. Your mother's case fits a pattern we've been documenting, Sarah explained. Premier National has been particularly aggressive in targeting elderly Italian Americans in several major cities. Diana also called 2 consumer protection attorneys who had dealt with Kennedy's office in the past. Both gave him high marks for understanding the technical aspects of financial regulations and for following through on commitments to families who'd shared their stories. He's not the most flashy senator, one attorney told her, but he does his homework and he keeps his word. That afternoon, Diana drove to her mother's small apartment to discuss Kennedy's invitation. Rosa Rossetti listened to her daughter's account of the previous evening with wide eyes. You yelled at a senator? She asked in accented English. Madonna mia Diana, what would your father say? But as Diana explained Kennedy's investigation and the potential legislation, Rosa's expression grew more hopeful than it had been in months. If telling my story could help other families, Rosa said slowly, then maybe something good can come from this terrible situation. Diana felt tears welling up as she watched her mother. Still proud, despite everything she'd lost. Consider how her pain might prevent others from suffering the same fate. Are you sure you'd be okay talking to a senator about what happened? Rosa straightened in her chair with the dignity that had carried her through decades of working double shifts to provide for her family. I have nothing to be ashamed of. Those people tricked me with papers I couldn't understand. If Senator Kennedy can stop them from doing it to other grandmothers, then I will tell him everything. Diana hugged her mother, feeling a pride that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with family. Diana called Kennedy's office that afternoon and accepted the invitation to Washington. Sarah Chen arranged their flights and hotel accommodations and briefed Diana on what to expect during their visit. Senator Kennedy likes to keep these meetings informal, Sarah explained. He'll probably want to hear your mother's story in her own words, then discuss how we can use that information to strengthen our legislation. The following Tuesday, Diana and Rosa flew to Washington together. Rosa had never been on an airplane before, and despite everything that had brought them here, Diana found herself enjoying her mother's wide-eyed excitement as they circled over the Capitol dome. "Is that where they make the laws?" Rosa asked, pressing her face to the window. Diana nodded, struck by the surreal fact that they were here because she'd yelled at a senator in a restaurant. Kennedy met them personally at his office in the Russell Senate office building, greeting Rosa in careful Italian that made the elderly woman beam with delight. "Senator Kennedy?" she exclaimed, taking his hand in both of hers. "Grazie for helping families like mine." Kennedy's eyes twinkled as he responded in halting Italian, making Rosa laugh for the first time since Diana could remember. They spent 2 hours in Kennedy's office, with Rosa telling her story in detail while Kennedy took careful notes. He asked thoughtful questions about the specific tactics Premier National had used, the timeline of events, and the responses Rosa had received from various agencies when she tried to get help. Diana watched her mother grow more confident as she realized Kennedy was treating her story with genuine respect and attention. After the formal interview, Kennedy surprised them by inviting them to lunch in the Senate dining room. "I want you to meet some other folks who are working on this issue," he explained as they walked through the Capitol corridors. Diana felt overwhelmed by the grandeur of the building, but Kennedy chatted easily with Rosa about her life in Chicago, putting both women at ease. At lunch, Kennedy introduced them to 3 other senators who were co-sponsoring his predatory lending bill, as well as 2 families who had been victimized by schemes similar to what Rosa had experienced. Diana listened as elderly Americans from different states shared remarkably similar stories of confusion, pressure, and loss. The pattern was undeniable and heartbreaking. What struck Diana most was how Kennedy interacted with these families. He remembered personal details from previous conversations, asked about grandchildren by name, and treated each person's story as unique and important, rather than just another data point. This wasn't political theater. It was genuine concern for real people who had been hurt by systemic problems. After lunch, Kennedy walked Diana and Rosa back to his office. "Mrs. Rossetti," he said to Diana's mother, "your story is going to help us make a stronger case for this legislation. But I want you to know that whether or not this bill passes, I'm going to make sure Premier National answers for what they did to you specifically." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "Senator, I never thought anyone in government would care about an old Italian lady." Kennedy knelt beside Rosa's chair and took her hands gently. "Mrs. Rossetti, you remind me of my own grandmother. She taught me that government's job is to protect families like yours from people who would take advantage of their trust." He looked up at Diana. "Your daughter fought for you the way my grandmother would have fought for her family. That takes courage, and it got my attention in a way no amount of lobbying ever could." As they prepared to leave, Kennedy walked them to the elevator personally. "Diana," he said, "I want you to know that what happened at the restaurant was exactly what I needed to hear. Sometimes we get so caught up in policy details that we forget these issues affect real families. Your anger reminded me why this work matters." Diana felt tears threatening as she realized how completely her opinion of this man had changed. On the flight back to Chicago, Rosa dozed against Diana's shoulder while Diana stared out at the clouds, processing everything they'd experienced. She thought about how wrong her assumptions had been, how a moment of fury had led to an opportunity to help prevent other families from suffering as theirs had. Sometimes, she realized, the most important conversations began with conflict. 6 weeks later, Diana was working the evening shift at Romano's when Tony called her over to the television above the bar. "Diana, look," he said, pointing at the screen. C-SPAN was broadcasting a Senate Banking Committee hearing, and there was Kennedy questioning a Premier National executive about their lending practices. He's using your mother's case, Tony said excitedly. Listen. On the television screen, Senator Kennedy was methodically dismantling Premier National's CEO with Rosa Rossetti's story. Mr. Davidson, Kennedy said in his distinctive drawl, I'd like you to explain to this committee how your company convinced a 74-year-old widow who spoke limited English to sign a reverse mortgage with an interest rate that doubled every 2 years. The CEO squirmed uncomfortably as Kennedy held up a stack of documents. Diana watched in amazement as Kennedy presented Rosa's case with devastating precision. He had every document, every phone call transcript, every piece of evidence that showed how Premier National had deliberately targeted vulnerable elderly homeowners. This is Mrs. Rosa Rossetti's file, Kennedy continued, his voice growing stern. A woman who worked double shifts for 40 years to pay off her home, only to lose it to your company's predatory practices. The restaurant's dinner crowd gathered around the television as Kennedy's questioning intensified. Mr. Davidson, can you explain why your sales representatives were instructed to target elderly Italian Americans specifically? We have training materials from your company that identify cultural deference to authority as a vulnerability to exploit. The CEO's face flushed red as he stammered about standard marketing demographics. Kennedy wasn't finished. Mrs. Rossetti's case is not unique. We've documented 47 identical schemes your company has perpetrated in the Chicago area alone. 47 families destroyed by contracts they were deliberately prevented from understanding. Diana felt goosebumps as she realized that her mother's suffering was being transformed into a powerful force for justice. The committee hearing continued for another hour, with Kennedy and his colleagues presenting a comprehensive case against Premier National's predatory practices. By the end, the CEO had been forced to admit that his company's policies had been perhaps overly aggressive and that they would review their procedures. Diana knew that in political speak, this was tantamount to a complete surrender. But Kennedy wasn't satisfied with corporate promises. Mr. Davidson, this committee is recommending criminal prosecution for your company's violations of federal lending laws. Furthermore, we're demanding full restitution for every family victimized by your schemes, starting with Mrs. Rosa Rossetti of Chicago. The hearing room erupted in applause from the gallery, where Diana could see other families who had been hurt by similar schemes. Tony turned up the volume as Kennedy delivered his closing statement. This hearing represents exactly why government oversight matters. When companies prey on our most vulnerable citizens, when they use their sophisticated understanding of finance to exploit families who trusted them, Congress has a moral obligation to step in. Mrs. Rossetti's story and the courage of her daughter who demanded accountability reminded us that our job is to protect American families. As the C-SPAN coverage ended, Diana realized that every person in the restaurant was looking at her. Tony was beaming with pride. Diana, said Mrs. Patterson, a regular customer, was that about your mother? Diana nodded, still processing what she just witnessed. That senator actually did something, Mrs. Patterson continued. He kept his word. Diana felt a wave of emotion as the truth of those words sank in. The next morning, Diana's phone rang before her alarm went off. It was Sarah Chen from Kennedy's office. Diana, I have incredible news, Sarah said, her voice bubbling with excitement. Premier National has agreed to a settlement. Your mother will receive full restitution, enough to buy back her house, plus damages for everything she's been through. Diana sat up in bed, unable to believe what she was hearing. Furthermore, Sarah continued, the settlement includes a commitment to make restitution to every family Premier National victimized using similar tactics. Your mother's courage in sharing her story has helped us recover over $40 million for elderly homeowners across 7 states. Diana started crying, thinking about her mother's dignity in the face of such injustice, and how that dignity had sparked a chain of events that would help hundreds of families. But the most surprising call came that afternoon from Kennedy himself. Diana? He said. I wanted you to hear this directly from me. Premier National's board of directors fired their CEO this morning, and they've agreed to completely restructure their lending practices under federal oversight. Your mother's story didn't just get her justice, it's changed how this company will do business forever. 3 months later, Diana stood in the kitchen of her mother's old house, the house Rosa was now able to buy back, thanks to the premier national settlement. Rosa was making Sunday dinner for the extended family, humming Italian folk songs as she stirred her famous tomato sauce. The house smelled like home again, filled with the sounds and scents that had been missing from Rosa's small apartment. Kennedy had surprised them by accepting Diana's invitation to Sunday dinner during his next visit to Chicago. He sat at the kitchen table with Rosa, carefully writing down her recipe for braciole while she supervised his note-taking with good-natured criticism. No, Senator," Rosa laughed. "You must use your hands to mix the herbs. The food knows when you cook with love." After dinner, Kennedy helped Diana clear the dishes while Rosa dozed in her favorite armchair, the one she'd thought she'd lost forever. "You know," Kennedy said quietly, "what you did that night at the restaurant changed more than just your mother's situation. It reminded me why I ran for the Senate in the first place." Diana smiled, thinking about how far they'd all come from that moment of fury and misunderstanding. As Kennedy prepared to leave, Rosa pressed a container of leftover lasagna into his hands. "For your airplane," she insisted. "And you tell that nice Sarah that she must come visit us too." Kennedy hugged the elderly woman gently. "Mrs. Rossetti, you've taught me more about courage than most politicians ever learn. Thank you for trusting me with your story." Standing in her mother's doorway, Diana watched Kennedy's car disappear into the Chicago twilight. She thought about anger and justice, about assumptions and second chances, about how sometimes the most important conversations begin with conflict. Her mother's voice brought her back to the present. "Diana, that is a good man. Sometimes God uses our anger to point us toward His grace." 6 months later, Diana received an invitation to the White House signing ceremony for the Protecting Senior Citizens from Predatory Lending Practices Act. The bill that had started with Rosa's story and Kennedy's patient listening had passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support. Diana watched from the audience as the president signed legislation that would protect millions of elderly Americans from the schemes that had almost destroyed her family. During the reception after the signing, Kennedy found Diana in the crowd. "None of this would have happened without that night at Romano's," he told her. "Your anger opened a door that led to justice for thousands of families." Diana thought about the chain of events that had brought them here. How a moment of fury had sparked a friendship that changed both their lives and helped countless others. Back in Chicago, Diana had been promoted to general manager of Romano's, a position that came with enough financial security to help support her mother comfortably. More importantly, she'd found her voice as an advocate for elderly residents in her neighborhood, helping them navigate complex financial decisions and connecting them with resources when they needed help. Her experience with Kennedy had taught her that ordinary citizens could make extraordinary differences. Rosa's story had been featured in a documentary about predatory lending that aired on PBS, and she'd become something of a local celebrity in their Italian-American community. But what made her happiest was the weekly phone calls from Kennedy, who still consulted her about recipes and asked for her prayers before important votes. "He remembers that government is about people," Rosa would tell anyone who listened. Diana often thought about that October evening when anger and pain had driven her to confront a senator in her restaurant. She'd learned that sometimes our strongest emotions, even the difficult ones, can be tools that God uses to create positive change. Her fury had been justified, but Kennedy's patient response had transformed that anger into something constructive and healing. Most importantly, she discovered that real change happens when people choose understanding over assumptions. What started as a moment of righteous anger in a Chicago restaurant had become a testament to the power of listening, patience, and second chances. Diana had learned that sometimes the people we think are our enemies might actually be our allies. We just need to give them the opportunity to prove it. And sometimes, when we're brave enough to share our pain with someone who has the power to help, we discover that government can still work for ordinary families when guided by extraordinary grace. If this story of unexpected redemption touched your heart, Please subscribe for more inspiring tales of faith in action. Have you ever had your assumptions completely changed by someone's unexpected kindness? Share your story in the comments below.